Okay, the Industrial Revolution, as historians define it, historians are not of a single definition. They haven't created one definition of when the Industrial Revolution started. Different historians identify it starting at different dates, some as early as 1760s, 1770s, some as late as the 18 teens. So there's not much agreement amongst historians in that regard. But they do agree that the Industrial Revolution generally started in Britain. Britain had a lot of advantages. They emerged, especially from the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. They start building factories very quickly. The trick of the Industrial Revolution is to find ways of making labor faster, more efficient, and stronger, basically more reliable. And the way they wanted to do that was to take the things that muscle labor created, either through humans working or using animals to like pull a plow across a field or something like this, and take it out of the muscle labor of animals in one way or another and relocate it to machines. So the first big step was in the clothing industry, where prior to the Industrial Revolution, most clothes were made in households by people sitting around at night in their off hours when they're not out in the farm. And they would sit there, and mostly women would knit clothing. And they would literally sit there hour after hour knitting. And it's literally the muscle of their hands that's creating the clothes that people wore in the world. That was pretty much it. The Industrial Revolution changes that by taking the power of creating that stuff, the actual energy that goes into putting the material together, takes it out of the human muscle and puts it into machines. At first, if you've gone to high school, you should have heard about these big weaving looms, right, that are powered by water at first. Sound familiar? That's a good thing because it's accurate. They at first used water, so they located the machines next to streams because they have consistent water supply, so you attach a water wheel to the thing and that turns the cogs, which you can attach a machine to, which will turn the needle in the machine. Pretty basic? All right. The Industrial Revolution will seek to do that for all kinds of different creative forces and make all kinds of different products with machine labor, machine energy, rather than human or animal muscle energy. The United States doesn't go in for the Industrial Revolution. They start making small steps in it in, say, the late 18 teens, 1820s, basically before the Civil War starts in 1861. They make small steps. They start building railroads that to connect cities in what we today identify as the eastern areas, the East Coastline, the original 13 states, and what they then called the Northwest, the old Northwest, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois. That's as far as railroads went. They start building bridges, they start building small canals, things like that. Then that was the big push for early U.S. industrialization. Discussions about building a transcontinental railroad start very quickly in the 1840s when the United States conquers the Western territories. New Mexico, Utah, and eventually California and Oregon conquers much of those lands from Mexico in a war with Mexico in the mid-1840s. So once you get the creation of the United States as a country that stretches from the Atlantic to the Pacific, they immediately start talking about building a railroad that goes from literally the eastern cities along the Atlantic coastline all the way, especially to a place like San Francisco, which is the one big city in the West, in the Pacific coastline. This was a big task. It was going to take big investment. Basically, no company in the United States could build this itself. Didn't have the money, didn't have the resources. So it was clear that this was going to be a government project. And proposals are floated throughout the late 1840s, 1850s to start building the thing. They don't do it because of the factional politics, the North versus South kind of politics that are emerging in the 1850s. Basically, they can't decide which route to take. Northerners want to build the railroad through the north because the railroad is going to bring economic growth. If you build a railroad, there's going to have to be stops in between. What do people do when they stop? they get out, they go to eat, they get maybe a hotel room or something like that. So you get cities, big economic development along the railroad line. So Northerners wanted it built along the north, Southerners wanted it built along the south. They couldn't agree on the route. So this is really tabled until after the Civil War is over in 1865, and immediately comes back to kind of the forefront of American politics, along with Reconstruction. The South really harmed itself in developing the railroad when the Southern states seceded. They left the Constitution and formed their own government. So they don't have senators or representatives in Washington, D.C. anymore in the early 1860s. And in the middle of the Civil War in 1862, Congress passes a law to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And I believe it's called the Transcontinental Railroad Act of 1862. I'd have to look that up. Obviously, only Northerners are going to vote on that law. And guess where they decide to build the thing? Through the North. Pretty easy. They set aside the funding, and they basically say, we're going to wait till the war is over to actually build the thing. This is what this map shows, the railroads that already existed going into the Civil War. So this is what has already been built. And you can see most of the railroads in the United States have been built in the North, because that's where the U.S. had started building factories. And that's where the big population centers are. The South is still mostly agrarian. They're mostly still farmers. They don't have many gigantic cities or many kind of factory hubs. Okay, so here's a map of what the United States generally looks like. The 48 continental states, or there aren't 48 yet. A lot of these are just open territories. But one of the big problems of the Act is that they agreed that they would build it through the north, but they didn't attach a map of where the railroad should go from connecting basically the northwestern cities around what is Missouri, Illinois, and where the railroad should go from there all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So they left that pretty badly defined. Another thing they did was to understand that economic competition amongst different companies would get the railroad built quickest. If they only gave the whole job to one company and, say, paid the company per day, the company would drag its feet in order to take up more days and therefore get more money, right? So they said, we're going to empower two different companies to build the railroad from two different points, from the east, somewhere out here in the Great Plains, and from the west, starting in Sacramento, and that they will build toward the middle of the country and meet somewhere in between. And the U.S. government in this law also said that wherever these companies lay track, they also get to own land around the tracks. From, I believe it's 10 miles, the land that surrounds the track as it goes forward. So, the companies are inspired to build quickly, because if, say, the western line starts getting built and they pass through all the mountains and they get all the way into the plains and the eastern line barely gets started, the western company is going to take up all the land that that railroad occupies for the most part, right? So whoever goes faster will get more land for themselves. And when you build the railroad, cities tend to pop up and you get the growth in property value, right? You get towns, you get houses, and if the railroad owns the property, then they can split it up and sell off the land eventually and make a whole lot of money. And for that reason in particular, the railroads become the first really powerful U.S. corporations, the first really big businesses that will start to dominate government. And we'll talk more about the corruption of big business and government later on.
So when you said the railroads own the lands, what do you mean, like they
physically own the land. They were the landowners of the, not just the track, but for 5 miles from one side to the railroad, 5 miles to the other side. They literally own the surrounding land.
And they just build whatever they want on there.
Yeah, or they sell the land for profit. I mean, it's free land to them. So whatever they sell it for is just money to them. And eventually they will also operate the railroad, even though the government spends money to build it. this becomes a private property. So the companies will set rates for travel and shipping things across and whatnot. So that's another way that these companies become hugely wealthy. If there's only a few railroads connecting the whole country, if you want to travel from the East Coast to the West, or if you want to, say, take food or supplies or something and ship it to the West, you have basically only one option. That's what we call in economics a monopoly. And what do monopolists do with prices? They raise them as high as they possibly can because they know if you have no other options, you have to buy from them. And that's how they make money also. And we're seeing monopolization, what historians call concentration, continuing even today. And we're seeing also prices go up in a lot of different industries today. So there's two different companies that are empowered by this legislation to build the railroad. The one that starts in Sacramento is going to build eastward, and its big problem is to get over the Sierra Mountains in California, and then get through, say, Nevada, which is pretty arid desert, harsh conditions, and then get into the Rocky Mountains. And so they start building. One of the major problems for beginning to build in Sacramento is, this is a startup company basically. They go to the physical workers, the kind of manual laborers of Sacramento, who at that point are who? Gold prospectors. California is famous for discovering gold in all these places, so California's population expansion was mostly young men looking to go find gold out there somewhere. And they were used to digging in the ground, so they seemed to be the most likely labor pool for this startup railroad company to hire. They were everywhere. The problem with hiring them is that they go to work for the railroad for about 1 week, and they get their first paycheck, and then they leave. Because they only work to get enough money to go buy tools to go look for gold. So the railroad has a very long-term problem of keeping their own labor force. They eventually turn to the other major labor force of the West Coast, especially around San Francisco, and those were Chinese immigrants, who were often unemployed due to racist employment policies by many companies in the area. So they were desperate for work. And they were also used to hard physical labor. And they were desperate enough to actually take these jobs and keep them. And of course, the railroad paid as low wages as they could possibly get away with. There are no minimum wage laws yet in the United States, or even on the state level. So largely the Pacific side that starts in Sacramento, going eastward, is constructed physically by Chinese labor. And again, because the railroad doesn't very much care about their workers, as most rising industrial companies really don't, and it's pretty horrid. We'll get into the details of that a little bit later. Working conditions are dangerous. They work long hours. And, building through mountains and over canyons and stuff is dangerous work. And if you have a mountain in your way, oftentimes the company doesn't want to take the time or the resources to go around the mountains. So they choose to use dynamite to blast through. And that dynamite back then wasn't the most reliable thing in the world. And many of these workers are killed. They continue building right through the middle of winter. If you've ever been up in, say, northeastern California or the Reno area in the middle of winter, it's cold. It snows a lot. If you've ever heard of the Donner Party, that's where those people got stuck and starved to death, turned to cannibalism, because they couldn't get out because there's so much snow. But the railroad continues construction. And there are reports of Chinese immigrants dying along the way in the middle of winter and being buried in the snow, and their bodies not being found for quite a few months. So the railroad in the West, its big problem is really weather conditions and the physical geography. And they employ tactics to try to overcome that in some pretty cutthroat ways. But that's the kind of short story of the western side. The eastern side will basically start off around the Missouri area, and they will build across the Great Plains, large flat lands. which seem to be very obviously much easier working conditions. So what do you think their major challenge is? Native attacks. Because the United States armies didn't really control a lot of this place. It was open land. And native tribes are still militantly resisting being kicked out of their ancestral lands. And the U.S. Army sometimes has to go in and force them out. And we'll talk about that later in the semester in detail. But native groups often attack the rail line and attack the worker encampments and even attack the locomotives themselves as symbolic of the continued reach of Western civilization, and in really one of the some of the last-ditch desperate attempts to keep the white European civilization out of these lands. So that's their major problem going forward. Another major problem for the Eastern Line is just basic corruption. The Eastern Line created a company called the Credit Mobilier, which was basically a dummy company that was created to sell resources to the railroad. So the railroad is getting government funding, and some employees of the railroad go off and create this third or second company called the Credit Mobilier, which was literally selling supplies to the railroad company. And because the company had its workers running the mobilier, their job was to inflate prices as much as possible. Because the more costs that the railroad can go to the government and say, we have to get this much money to buy the resources to actually build the thing, the more money they're going to get from the government. And if these prices are inflated, that just means more profit for the company. And when this scandal breaks in U.S. newspapers, and it's revealed that U.S. congressmen and senators are investors in the railroad company and the Credit Mobilier, it's obvious that they are spending taxpayer money to enrich themselves. It's obvious corruption, and there is public outrage. And you get these kind of political cartoons where the figure of kind of justice and liberty is lining up all these corrupt politicians and basically lining them up for some kind of moral punishment.
So corruption pretty much started way back in those days.
Oh, the United States government is already corrupt. There's no doubt about that. If you ever read the original Constitution, it's a pretty restricted vote. Most Americans did not vote for a U.S. president. They did not vote for their senators. They only voted for their member in the House of Representatives. And that doesn't change until the 1890s. So this is obvious insider corruption. A little bit different from what we have today, but it's still basically the same monster. The rich are running the government, and they're running the government for their own profit. And we can point that out in many, many, many ways today. So other questions about this? All right, so they continue building. Not always in the most reliable way, and this is one of my favorite images to depict that. They had to go over, railroads have to have a fairly flat surface to go over, right? Because they don't want to be going up and downhill very quickly, because that's just going to harm the cars and it's going to destroy the locomotive and whatnot. So they need a fairly flat surface to go through. And that was a big problem when you encountered mountains. You had to dynamite through. You encountered canyons. You had to build bridges across, and bridges are expensive to build. And these are greedy corporations who look to cut costs whenever they can to maximize their profit. And this is one of my favorite pictures because they had a space that they probably should have built a bridge over, but instead they just shoved a bunch of ground underneath and put the track over it. And these locomotives and all these cars weigh thousands and thousands of pounds. So it's an open question: is the dirt going to hold up when the actual thing goes over it? Corporate greed and cost cutting corners is pretty apparent in one of the first major instances of the U.S. Industrial Revolution kind of being brought to the national stage. Another major problem in the law was that they did not, again, create any kind of route on a map that the railroad should follow, and they encourage these companies to build as fast as possible. By the last couple years of the railroad construction, 1868, 1869, each company is building about 15 to 20 miles of track per day. They're hugely efficient. And they're basically in a race against each other because the more land they get, the more money they're going to make. And the sad and strange thing, but completely logical when you understand their economic motivation, as they started getting close to each other, the eastern line started turning south and the western line started turning north. And this becomes a problem in Congress because, I mean, this is, the whole country is keeping up with this stuff on a daily basis. Where are they at? This is front page news, day after day, for several years, trying to project when it's going to be finished and where the lines are going to meet. But as they're watching closely in the last few months, it looks like they're going to pass each other and just keep going and going and going. So Congress and the President of the United States has to get involved to set a place where these two should meet. So you get what in the end ends up being a fairly inefficient kind of really weird turn north on the eastern line, the blue line, to get to that place as quick as possible. The President set a place called Promontory Point, Utah, as the meeting place. So they were told to go there and unite the two lines. And the unification occurs on May 10th of 1869. Newly elected President Grant shows up. He was elected in November 1868, was inaugurated in March of 69. So he's only been president for a couple months, and he's really the big national hero. And he shows up to personally nail down the final spike that connects the two lines. And it's a giant national celebration because this thing was just unthinkably large, unthinkably expensive. And there were a lot of critics who said that the United States cannot do something yet like this. It is not within even government power to do something like this. So this was a kind of awe-inspiring and surprising thing to a lot of American people and a lot of people watching this all over the world.
Where was these two connections now? You say Utah?
Yep, northern Utah. And this is the official photograph. And they don't stop there. They keep building more transcontinental railroads up into the late 1800s, early 1900s, because this one was so useful. So other companies are created, again, through mostly corrupt business practices and bribery in Congress and whatnot. And when you look at the amount of railroads built, and on the left side and on the right, the amount of federal government land given to these companies, it is overwhelming. This is a huge amount of wealth that is literally just turned over to private corporate hands. I mean, they make a killing in this business, in land and in setting the rates. So they're selling passage, they're selling freight, bulk rates to move things, and they're also going to start selling land. So they're some of the biggest landowners in the West, the western half of the country.
What's the name of the company? Railroad company?
There's the Pacific, the Union Pacific, the Central Pacific. Those were the first two original ones that were forced to meet in Utah. There's a whole bunch of other ones. There's Southern Pacific. I think the one identified as Washington. I can't remember all of them offhand. One of the main owners of the first major railroad was a guy named Leland Stanford. And when eventually Congress gets around to investigating how much money he personally made and his basically corrupt business practices to make that money, when they start asking for his internal company documents to, accounting documents basically, to see where the money went, he burns them all late at night. in his office. So he had a lot to hide, and he did so consciously. And there is so much public outrage at a lot of this stuff that he is really forced to spend a lot of his money on things for the public good. And that's where he gets Stanford University. He took a lot of that money and built a college in the West to symbolically tell the people that, I'm on your side, I'm not all that bad. And people at Stanford University don't like to think about that very much, and they definitely don't want to talk about it. But that's where that school comes from. It is through the egregious accumulation of wealth, through extreme corruption. And when the investigation hit, destroy all the records. All right. The Transcontinental Railroad symbolizes a lot of the new emergence of at least the new major investment that the United States government will make, and the rise of corporate power, which is a new system, a new source of real wealth and political power in the United States after the Civil War. Even the largest corporations, the most profitable businesses in the United States, could not afford to build something like this. They didn't have the cash on hand. They couldn't even get loans to do something like this for the most part. They needed government support. They needed taxpayer money to do it. So this shows that a lot of the early movements toward industrialization that are government-sponsored have to be government-sponsored. And the combination of private ownership with public money is extremely powerful, and builds some of the largest and most powerful, wealthy corporations in the United States in the 1800s and going into the 1900s, and some could argue even today. Defense contractors in the United States and oil companies are some of the most profitable in the world. Oil companies, ExxonMobil a few years ago posted the 4th highest profit margin of any company in all of recorded human history for 1 year. And they're still taking government subsidies because they're not making enough money. They have to take yours. So you can continue arguing that the combination of public funding with private ownership is still a huge creator of wealth in the United States today. And if you haven't been keeping up with the news, some laws were proposed in Congress just this past spring to end those oil company subsidies. And what did Congress do? Yep, voted against it.
Yeah.
Why? Because those oil companies pay them to do that through campaign donations. So that's the real source of, the major source of U.S. political corruption today. But the more the government invests in creating, especially factories, transportation networks, and whatnot, the more efficient those systems become. So the government steps in and gives the initial funding, and once those companies start making a lot of money, they reinvest to get more and more efficient, to work faster, stronger, more efficiently. So especially manufacturing, industry, the creation of goods in factories grows in the United States exponentially in the late 1800s and early 1900s, to the point where the United States will become the industrial powerhouse of the world, even surpassing Great Britain and Germany during World War I. And the Europeans knew that. The United States became the largest economy in the world during World War I and has been ever since. The railroad also, for a lot of Americans, symbolized the Industrial Revolution coming to their neighborhood. Remember, a lot of these people are farmers, and people had been farmers overwhelmingly throughout all of human history, going back to the earliest cities in Egypt and Mesopotamia and India. Their daily lives just hadn't changed very much. They go out to the fields, they grow the food, they participate in their religious ideas, all that kind of stuff. And that's how human life had really been down through the centuries, going far, far back into the past. And then the railroad arrives and brings things that move faster, and they alter the entire landscape of the area. The railroad has to dynamite mountains, they have to build bridges, and the landscape is scarred by these huge tracks, these Trains are huge machines that most people out on the farm said maybe never seen a small machine before, and these machines are as big as their house. So it was an overwhelming psychological experience for a lot of people. The railroads also show us the poor working conditions that most manual laborers, industrial workers, will toil under until about getting into the mid-1900s. So that's not going to change very effectively. And that the overinvestment that companies make for efficiency, because they think that if they build a factory that they're going to make a ton of money by mass producing something for sale. If they make too much of that product, supply and demand happens. Supply and demand kicks in. So what happens if you overwhelm the market with too many products for people to buy?
Prices go down.
Yeah, the price of the individual one plummets. And therefore, company profits plummet. When company profits plummet, they lay off workers, which workers have less money to spend, so they buy less products, which means company profits go lower and they lay off more workers. So you get into cyclical economic downturns that will eventually become known as depressions. In the 1800s, they called them panics, economic panics. Depression really starts coming into use in the early 1900s. For the most part, today we call them recessions, at least short-term downturns. Yeah. So overinvestment and overproductivity, too much efficiency, and being kind of out of control in production, not setting limits on how much you should make and put into the marketplace for sale, causes layoffs and depressions itself. And that becomes one of the major problems of capitalism, as the major critics of capitalism will point out, and even as Adam Smith himself pointed out in his big book on economics, The Wealth of Nations, in the 1700s. So questions about any of this?
What year was the economic panic again?
There's many of them in the late 1800s. It's cyclical. The late 1800s from, say, 1870 until the Great Depression hits in about 1932. The United States was a boom and bust economy. It rose very quickly and then crashed, and then rose again and then crashed, and happened over and over again, cyclically, for a good 60 years. And that cycle is largely ended after the 1940s for reasons we'll talk about later. Or really since about the mid-30s, but we'll get into that later. Other questions? No? Okay. Historians identify two different kinds of industrial revolutions when you read kind of big histories of the Industrial Revolution. Some historians even break them down into 3 and 4 different levels, but we'll stick with the more simplistic kind of 2. The first Industrial Revolution got kick-started, for the most part, in the late 1700s, especially in Britain, where they started building machines that took advantage of especially water sources as sources of energy. They connected a water wheel to the stream or a river, used that power of the river to turn the wheel, and they connected the machines to the wheel so that they could, move needles on a weaving loom or something like that. The major material that they built the machines out of was iron. You need something strong because the river runs fast. The wheels turn fast, and if you build these machines out of weak materials, they'll break easily. And you have to fix them, which slows down your production. And iron at the time was the hardest metal known. Later on, a steam engine is created by James Watt in the late 1700s, and then adapted by a lot of machines. And eventually, when you take a whole bunch of machines and put in one building, then you get a factory. You start getting steam-powered factories as an even more consistent and reliable source of energy than water, which is basically put a bunch of water in one place, heat it up, and put a funnel over the top so that the steam that rises from the boiling water can be directed into one consistent and predictable energy source. So that's the first level in the Industrial Revolution. The second level starts trying to deal with the problems that the first level created. Mostly, the machines break, steam is much more powerful than water. You have to come up with a stronger material to make machines out of. And they start introducing kind of scientific research to create new sources of material. And the big one they create is steel, which is basically iron smelted down to another level, down to its kind of core strength. And you make steel out of it. Steel is, number one, far stronger than iron, and number two, much lighter, which makes it more efficient to move around. You can put a lot more steel on a train and send it to another city to make stuff than you can iron because it's much lighter. They also start harnessing electricity at this point and start creating electric currents and batteries to run machines. And they start using gasoline made out of oil as the major power source for transportation, especially with the combustion engines that cars will run on. And we'll get to the rise of automobiles later. So those are the two major sources of energy, and these are, things that are created by chemical research, right? Scientific investment by companies to find better sources and better materials. The second level industrial revolution starts coming about in about the 1850s in Europe, and this is where Germany starts to catch up to Britain, and even Germany surpasses Britain in the 1870s. So Germany is the big industrial power in Europe in the late 1800s, and the United States will overshadow that in the early 1900s. So the big industrial powers by about the year 1900 are Germany, Britain, the United States, France to a lesser extent. Those are the big ones. Okay. In studying the rise of steel as a resource, we also see the rise of a whole new industry because it's a whole new product. The guy who corners the market on the steel industry in the United States is named Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was a very intelligent child who went to work for a telegraph company, and in fact became a business manager of that kind of city-level company as a teenager. So he has kind of naturally understood management and investment theory. Became very wealthy when he convinced his mom to mortgage her house and take that money invested in a new startup company, and that company blew up, went big, and he made a killing off of selling the stock, and he made enough money to never have to work again. So as a guy in his 20s and 30s, he's so rich he doesn't have to work, so he doesn't hold a job, and he just, like rich people tend to do, they get involved in what they're interested in. And he was interested in building bridges. He viewed that as a major kind of intellectual challenge, so he studied bridge building. And right at this time, steel is created, first in Europe, and then the idea comes over to the United States. And immediately Carnegie realizes that we need bigger bridges in the United States because we have railroads that will use bridges. We're going to have a whole lot more people to move around. And he realizes that the future bridges will be built by steel infrastructure, steel beams. So he quickly realizes, as an already rich person, that if he can invest in steel companies and corner the market in steel, that he can make even more money. And he does. And he becomes, through owning steel mills and cornering that market, within a few years, the richest person on the planet. Because he sells steel to the U.S. government, to cities, to individual companies. Virtually anyone who wants to buy steel to make things buys it from Carnegie. So he becomes known as the major steel baron of the late 1800s, and literally the richest man in the world. New York City was one of the first big experiments in monumental bridge building. New York City at the time was Manhattan Island, and only Manhattan Island. The other cities around it were Brooklyn, Queens, that kind of stuff. New York City is not unified. All those 5 boroughs are not brought together into one city until 1898. And one of the big problems was, just like today, the big businesses operate on Manhattan Island, but the major populations live in the other boroughs, in the surrounding communities. And to get to work every day, they had to cross the rivers. So they set up ferry systems that just became overwhelmed. So New York City starts talking about building a bridge from Brooklyn to Manhattan Island to allow people to travel across much easier. And again, there were a lot of critics in the United States saying it is too large of a river, nothing that big has ever been built before, it's a suicide mission. But with steel, they actually build the thing. And this image gives you an idea of the scope of this project. These are the large ferry boats that move people back and forth. And you can see they're absolutely dwarfed by the size of the eventual bridge that is built entirely out of steel infrastructure.
Didn't a lot of workers die from building that? How was that?
A few, but this is much more kind of public stuff. This is in the middle of a giant city, so the company tries to give a little bit better conditions because they don't want to, harm their own reputation. But this took years, and today it's a fairly common thing because we use steel to build virtually all big public infrastructure today. And the Brooklyn Bridge is still in use on a daily basis. And obviously they've built other bridges that span the river ever since. And has anyone been to New York and walked across the Brooklyn Bridge? How long did it take?
I didn't walk across the whole thing.
But it's a long walk.
It is.
Yeah, it's not something small. One of my friends thought it would be really cool to walk across that thing when he went on vacation there in between Christmas and New Year's, which out there is like 0 degrees. And he thought it would be cool to walk across and hold a video camera. And he said that his hand was basically frozen solid to the video camera by the time he got to the end. And not the smartest person on the planet, but that's what he did. He thought it was cool. And he told me all about it. But it's a long walk, especially probably in less than freezing conditions. And again, this is national news, just like the railroads. This is front page stuff. Can they actually do it? This is a great kind of national challenge. And when the thing is finally constructed, they invite the sitting president of the United States at the time, a guy named Chester Arthur, and he leads the first group to actually formally walk across the bridge. So this is so important that the president shows up again to be on site because this is where all the reporters and the photographers are. And, presidents do these things to make themselves look good. And Arthur was from New York. He was a politician from New York City, so he had local ties. Steel is used to build the major infrastructure, not just in New York City, but throughout cities throughout the world, even to this day. And you have to realize at this point in U.S. history, the major cities are growing massively through immigration mostly. And also because the factories are being put in the big cities first. So if you are an unemployed person anywhere in the country, you go to a city to try to find work. So the cities are growing massively in population. And they struggle to build enough housing for people to actually live in the city. Of course, cities have limited amount of territory to build housing on. So instead of spreading out, they start building up. And the only way they could do that in the late 1800s to build enough living space for people is to use steel frame buildings that can be built much higher. In the early United States, the highest buildings you ever got were about 4 or 5 stories. But quickly in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you start getting buildings that are 30, 40, 50 stories because steel is much stronger, much more reliable. And the Twin Towers that are eventually built in New York City in the 1970s are built with several different systems of interlocking steel kind of reinforcement right at the core. And are, interestingly, were designed to take plane hits without collapsing. They were engineered to do that, which is an interesting thing. But that's how far the engineering talent and ability goes when they start figuring new and more modern ways of building steel buildings. So you start getting the rise of skyscrapers in specifically New York City, but this spreads to other cities in the world. And the city-wide landscape changes dramatically in just a few decades. And this is one of the scariest pictures I'll ever show you in this class because I'm very afraid of heights. And just looking at this just makes me sweat. But again, this shows you not always the safest working conditions. These guys were working so up high in the building that they didn't have time to take their lunch break and make it all the way back down, so they ate up there. They brought their lunches up there. Yeah. And there's, I think it was his picture. Yeah. Who do you think my favorite guy is on this one? The guy who's drinking up there. What the hell? But this is so high up, you can hardly even see the streets. There's so many buildings around. So either brave or stupid, you can make your own decision. But this shows you that the working conditions were not perfect. This is what industrial labor is like. Not always that high up, but dangerous, unsafe. Because there aren't any real state laws or federal laws creating good working conditions or enforcing any kind of working conditions on companies. Okay, so corporate power is growing. And the rich are getting far, far richer. When the Industrial Revolution begins, a lot of people who have cash to invest in kind of entrepreneurial business attempts, they take their money and they start building factories. And when factories become the new source of wealth in worldwide society, the average middle class or poor people don't have the money to go in and become owners. So it's the rich that go in and start building this stuff. They become the ownership and the managers of these companies, and they are hugely enriched. So the rich get vastly richer in the late 1800s in the United States. And the poor are far less well off than they even were before. You have what we call the rise of inequality, economic inequality in the U.S. A lot of people argue that that was not necessarily a bad thing. And some of the philosophical arguments for accepting this inequality go back to Darwin's ideas on natural selection. Do we have to go over Darwin with the birds, how natural selection works? You guys understand that? Hopefully ever since like 7th grade, I hope. Yeah, it's the idea of survival of the fittest. That these organisms evolve over time and they adapt to their surroundings. And those that are best adapted, the strongest or the fastest, survive, and their competitors are either destroyed or they don't get enough food. So that the best adapted tend to have more children, so they tend to dominate the population over time. Right? That's the general theory. Okay. Philosophers took this idea of natural selection and applied it beyond just animal and plant evolution. One guy in particular, named Spencer, took this idea of natural selection and survival of the fittest and applied it to human society. And this becomes known as social Darwinism, even though Darwin said, "Don't put my name on this, I don't agree with it." So it should be called Spencerianism or something like that, but Darwinism was the big kind of term of the time, so they applied it. So Spencer and his followers look to apply the idea of natural selection to human society. And the basic idea is that we are all born. Yes, we're often born into different circumstances. But he argues we are not born equal. Some people are born with a greater natural intelligence. Some people are born with an ability to run faster or an ability to be stronger physically. So there is no equality of means. Does that make sense? Amongst individuals. They are vastly different from each other. And Spencer argues that's not a bad thing, because naturally, the strongest will come to dominate. If you are one of the people who can just for some reason have a proclivity for learning from a book or doing advanced mathematics or something like that, you will probably go to the higher education levels, therefore get higher degrees, go into management, and you will be one of the kind of controllers of society. You will be one of the rich, one of the managers, one of the leaders. And of course, the most intelligent or the most fit or maybe the most cutthroat tend to rise in politics. They get into elected government office because they know how to use the system the best. Whereas the rest of us, average workers, don't have that kind of natural ability to understand those levels, or at least compete very effectively in those levels. So we are the ones that kind of naturally fall below, and we end up doing the kind of daily work in the factories or on the farms. And Spencer argued that's a good thing because you get kind of the cream rising to the top. The best tend to rise up to a level of social dominance. And if they are the best and the smartest, maybe they should run society. That's his argument. Yeah.
Was this guy rich?
I don't know how wealthy he was, but he was highly educated. He understood a lot of different philosophical arguments. And back then, going to college was basically a game for the rich. The middle and poor classes had no access to college because there were no loans back then, unless you want to go to a bank and get like 40% interest or something like that. But back then, going to college or a university, you had to have the cash up front to pay. And obviously, the average worker didn't, and today doesn't. And community colleges didn't exist back then, so it's basically universities. If you don't have the 50 or 60 grand per year up front to go to USC or Harvard or something like that, you don't go. You get a job. And Spencer argued that that may be a good thing because it keeps the rich in power and it keeps the most educated, hopefully, running society. A lot of people disagreed with this, and Darwin was one of them, who said that, it may sound good on paper, but when you apply this to the real world, you get a whole lot of kind of natural results of it that tend to harm human society. Number one, you dehumanize the lower classes. You basically start treating them like animals who are undeserving of government help in any way, because if you're down there in the poor levels, you're there because you naturally belong there. You can't compete. So the philosophers and politicians start arguing, why should we create welfare systems? It's just giving money to poor people who are inefficient. So it's just a waste of money. Forget it. And that's where that's where their stance is for, until the 1930s. They don't set up many welfare programs at all. They wait for charities to do that kind of stuff. And, of course, charities are overwhelmed because there's so much poverty in the U.S., even today. And on the other side, this natural result of this theory says you shouldn't tax the rich very much because they're the achievers. They're the ones who go off and build great things, and they're the controls of society, and they have competed and survived. They are the best. So why do you want to take from the best and give to the worst? It's a waste of resources. If the rich are rich because they are the best at what they do, then let them control the money because they know how to invest it. Sound familiar? Yes. These political theories are still kicking around today. And they are still very heavily argued. A lot of politicians that talk about these things don't want to talk about the levels of poverty and misery that existed in the United States back then. They largely just don't want to discuss it. But those are the political systems and the political theories that went into existence and ran the United States for a long, long time. And of course, there's the idea that you shouldn't really let the poor mix with the rich very much. And you should avoid allowing your family, if you're a rich person, you don't want to let your daughter marry a poor person because that person's not fit to survive. And if they get together and have children, maybe they will have kind of middle-level children. So a lot of these intelligence theories get eventually so even racist that they have complete separations of the classes. Because you don't want to really mix the good and the bad, because then you're going to come out with basically a mule. You'll come out with someone who's ineffective, mid-level intelligence, and your family doesn't want that. You want to marry another rich person because they're going to breed together and create very strong, attractive, powerful people. And that's where you get a lot of social ideas about, if you watch movies based in the 1800s, they talk about the rich people trying to use good breeding. Literally. in choosing who they marry and who they have children with. We would think of it, in my mind, as a very strange thing. But there's a lot of kind of Victorian romantic ideas about that kind of stuff. You only should try to fall in love with rich people. Yeah. So questions about that at all? That's an important theory to understand then and today, especially if you watch political debates. These ideas are very powerful today.
Very much so.
Yeah. No questions. What do you think Darwin and some of the other philosophers' major attack against applying this to human society is? As opposed to applying it to evolution in animals and plants. Any ideas? Number one, Darwin argued that evolution happens over thousands and thousands of years, huge amounts of time, whereas Spencer is talking about, just a few years or a few decades. And also, evolution happens largely without choice, right? Whereas this is a moral choice. You can make the choice to pass laws that would help poor people. There's a certain level of ethics involved in this that does not apply so much to long-term life evolution. Okay, moving forward. There are also two different kinds of theories about how corporations are coming together and becoming powerful. So to stick to the two basic generalizations, one is called vertical integration, where a company builds to run its company literally from the ground up, from the very first step in the production process to the very last step in sales, marketing. So companies like Carnegie Steel and especially Gustavus Swift's armor meat packaging plant, for instance, Carnegie Steel gets into buying land where they think the resources to make steel are, especially coal. They buy that land and they create mining companies, subsidiary companies that do the mining. And then they create transportation systems, railroads, owned by the company that only exist to bring raw coal out of the mines and send it to the steel plant. And then, of course, you have your factory there to make the product. He also hired armies of advertisers and marketers and political insiders who had contacts in government to sell the steel, to sell the manufactured product. So this is literally a company operating from the ground up, from the first step in production to the last step. That's why it's called vertical integration. Only one company is doing all of it. So it's all directed by the corporate leadership. And these often make companies and industries more efficient. If you have one company doing the mining, another company doing the transport, another company doing the creation of the steel, and another company doing the sales, then each middleman is going to raise the price, right? Because they need to make money in the middle. If you have one company doing it, they can do it all itself and sell the product at a far lower price in the end, into the marketplace. And that's what these two guys figured out. And a lot of other companies do that. They create vertically integrated businesses. And they often improve the efficiency of whatever they're making.
What's the other guy's name?
Gustavus Swift. Armor Foods becomes famous for creating refrigerated railroad cars that would travel to farms and beef slaughtering places, so they could take the meat literally from the point of where it was slaughtered and packaged and put it into refrigerated cars and move it to market without the meat going bad, without it spoiling. And Swift largely cornered a big chunk of the meat manufacturing industry in the United States. And Armor Foods still around, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there you go. The other way is called horizontal integration, which is not from the ground up, but think of it as one company looking out at the horizon of all of its competitors and buying them out one at a time, or destroying them somehow through price wars, or getting government contracts through bribery that exclude the other company. And the real master of this in the late 1800s is John Rockefeller, who owns eventually nearly the entire oil production in all the United States. He runs Standard Oil.
What year was this?
Oh, it's many decades in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. So Standard Oil has a monopoly over the oil industry in the U.S. And he achieved that not through becoming more efficient, but simply by using his vast wealth and buying out the competition. If a new company rose up with a better idea of how to move oil or get it out of the ground or something like that, he would just simply buy them out. Does that still happen today? Absolutely. You guys have heard of a company called Google? Do you know how many companies Google has bought? Over 200. Because they have smaller companies, startups have new ideas about how to make money off the internet, and Google buys them one after another because Google has, does anyone know how much revenue they have per year? Over $30 billion per year. So if you start a company that figures out a good way of using the internet to make money somehow, Google may come knocking on your door with the $5 million check because they don't want competition. And the same thing with Facebook now. They've been buying up companies left and right the past couple of years. They don't like competition. They want to monopolize, which is really the goal of almost any company, right? Because monopoly is the number one guaranteed way to sell things. If you're the only one selling stuff in a given market, people have to go to you if they want to buy it. Does that make sense? So the number one way to get guaranteed sales is to achieve a monopoly. And almost all capitalists have that desire, or that end goal. Okay, one of the last things I want to talk about is called the cult of domesticity that rises in Western Europe and the United States in the late 1800s. Started off in Britain in a lot of ways because Britain underwent the problems of industrialization first. And the problems are pretty well represented in this image. This is what industrial cities start looking like by the year 1900. They are huge. They have huge populations. There's a lot of unemployed workers, so there's a lot of crime. There's a lot of drinking. There's a lot of prostitution. And the people who have jobs work 10, 12, 14, 16 hours a day in a factory for very low wages. And they're not very happy about it. They're desperate. So in their desperation to survive and to somehow cope with this very hard life, a lot of them turn to drinking and brothels and crime and other kinds of things. So cities become dangerous places to live. And families start teaching. There's a real fear of the breakdown of society because crime is so rampant and disease with so many people packed together and whatnot. Pollution. It's really kind of horrible places to live. Much like a lot of modern cities. So a lot of political and cultural leaders start trying to look for ways to solve this problem. How can we save human society from kind of degeneration and social collapse? And they turn to the family. They say that the family is the unit that raises children and teaches them some kind of ethical code, some kind of good behavior skills for their own protection. And a lot of this gets located in women, especially mothers, because mothers are usually the ones in the home raising the children on a daily basis, right? And that becomes a cultural thing also in the late 1800s. And women become the sources of morality, virtue in the family, and they pass that off, especially to their daughters. So this becomes a kind of socialized idea. And they tell their daughters, if you're living in the city, you might not want to wear very revealing clothing because there's a lot of drunk, violent men running around, which could have bad effect on you. They tell their daughters to avoid alcohol because that leads to some bad decision making eventually. So a lot of this kind of sexual morality is really inculcated into women throughout the generations, and you can see a whole lot of it today, even in modern U.S. culture. I mean, what do high school girls call each other if they're wearing something that's kind of unacceptable? Yeah, sluts or whores or something like that. It's a choice. Your enjoyment of sex is your own personal choice and how much you want to go for that goal. Should other people judge you for that? Probably not. But it's so ingrained in the culture. You know, are men in U.S. society usually ostracized for talking about wanting to have sex? Or with many different people? No, they get high fives. That's how our culture is. So a lot of these moral codes have seeped down to our own time. And they're destructive to a lot of people back then and today because they're restrictive of behavior. And the people who don't want to abide by these kind of social norms are ostracized. They're attacked. And they suffer psychological consequences. But it was a desperate attempt to deal with the problems of mass society, mass industrialization in the late 1800s.